Fatiha one more time for the memory of our sister who we lost. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المنتجبين صلى الله وسلم عليك يا رسول الله صلى الله وسلم عليك يا أبا عبد الله يا رحمة الله الواسعة ويا باب نجاة الأمة يا ليتنا كنا معكم سيدي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ولا تتمنوا ما فضل الله به بعضكم على بعض للرجال نصيب مما اكتسبوا وللنساء نصيب مما اكتسبن واسألوا الله من فضله إن الله كان بكل شيء عليما. صدق الله العلي العظيم. وصلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Verse number 32 of chapter 4 in the Quran reminds us not to covet what one another has. In other words, do not desire something that is destined for somebody else. In even simpler terms, the Quran is explaining the human tendency to see the grass as greener on the other side. And that's to say that we always think that others have it better. The person on the other side either has it better than me, they have less hardships than me, I'm struggling, my struggle is unique, nobody has struggled in the way that I have struggled, and it's all about me and my problems and my challenges. And if only I had more time, if only I had better looks, if only I had more money, if only. And sometimes we live an entire life based off of the phrase, if only. So the Quran says, وَلَا تَتَمَنَّوْا مَا فَضَّلَ اللَّهُ بِهِ بَعْضَكُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِمَّا اكْتَسَبُوا وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ مِمَّا اكْتَسَبْ. And the reality is that moral trials come with everything that is good and everything that is bad. So if you're rich, there are moral trials. If you're poor, there are moral trials. If you're wealthy, there are moral trials. If you're not, there are also moral trials. And if you read the commentary of this verse, you would come to know that commentators suggest that a group of women came to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And they asked him the question that, why is it that men receive double the inheritance of women? Or why is it that men are spiritually, it seems like spiritually they're placed ahead because they're placed at the forefront? For instance, in the issue of jihad, in the issue of battle and fighting. And it's very interesting because it seems from this verse that even during those days, men and women were confused about their roles in society, as we see today. Men and women confused about their roles in society. So in the case of jihad and being at the forefront, even though that was ordained to men, that was the responsibility of men, even in those early days, there were women that were fighting on the forefront. A prominent example of that is Nusayba bint Ka'b, a woman who was one of the first people who came from Medina to pledge to the Prophet, because before the Prophet left Mecca to go to Medina, there were a number of pledges that took place. And within those pledges, the people of Medina had pledged, had committed that if the Prophet came to them, they would serve his mission, they would help him. So normally that was the business of men. However, she was one of the only ladies that participated with the men. She wanted personally herself to pledge in her assistance and support of the Prophet. And when the Prophet came, she followed through with her commitment. She went out into the battlefield. In fact, during the Battle of Uhud, when times became tough, as described in the Quran, and when the Prophet was almost abandoned completely, narrations tell us that there was only a handful of people that stayed behind to defend the Prophet. About 5 or 6 people. She was one of those people. When other men had run away, she stood there defending him. Even after the life of the Prophet, she continued to participate by standing in the front lines of the battlefield. So it seems that even in those days, there was some confusion as to what the role of men and women are. And so in light of that, what I want to talk about is the question of masculinity and femininity. Because in today's world, those questions exist in contemporary society. And not just masculinity and femininity, but you have the rise of the modern feminist movement. And then there's the counter to that. If you've heard of the Meninist movement, we always there's always one-upsmanship. If you do something, I have to do it better. And where do those movements find their foundations? Now, I want to talk about it from a social perspective, but also creating our focus on the Quran. Because if you stray away from the Quran, you can get lost in the mumbo-jumbo of things. So, the number one question when it comes to masculinity, we have this idea of what masculinity is. We have this idea of what femininity is. And for most people, their ideas are informed by what? Simply by their association and what they see on TV. So when a boy looks up to his father, he's looking up to his father to provide a model of masculinity to him. When a boy or a girl looks up to the mother, they are looking up to her to fill the role of femininity. So the question is, how do we define ourselves? How do people define themselves? Because these terms sometimes they're arbitrary, and sometimes they sort of get confused and convoluted. How do you define yourself? Do you define yourself by your job? By your career? By you being a parent? If you wrote out the definition of myself, and you wrote out your name, what would you find there? Sometimes we tend to define ourselves by things that, are sort of arbitrary, and when we lose those things in our life, it's as if we've lost everything in our life. So if a person is described by their career or by their job for 40 or 50 years of their life, what happens when they're no longer practicing that job or practicing that career? When their entire purpose is based upon that title, when their entire meaning of life is based upon that title, what happens when they're stripped of that title? Or when they retire? They say one of the biggest killers of people is retirement. And by retirement, they not doing anything. Just giving up your job and then not committing yourself to anything meaningful or committing yourself to anything purposeful. And people who live long lives are people who continue, even after the age of quote-unquote retirement, they continue to put their life in meaningful projects and purposeful projects. So, how do you define yourself? If you ask yourself, when it comes to success, everybody wants success in this world. How do you define success? Is it by the fact that you are a son or a daughter or a wife or a husband? Is that how you define your success? The reason I bring that up is because we tend to sort of, with that mindset, we tend to reduce ourselves, human beings, to what they are in terms of the service that they can provide. So we look at a person and we say that as long as this person can provide this service, they are of value. As long as they can't provide this service anymore, they're of no value. They have no value to society at all. They have no value to their family at all. The other day I mentioned the story of the gentleman who was very successful, and he lived his life by the standard of living up to his father's image of success. He wanted his father to always be happy and proud. And then finally, when he purchased that home, if you remember the story, and the father looks in the corner of the room and says, there's a watermark on the ceiling. And he realized that at that moment that he's never going to be able to live up to his father no matter what. So this gentleman goes on, and he says that he would conduct interviews with some of the most successful people, and he would ask them, the first question he would ask them is, what is your measure of success? Like, where does your success come from? So he says one day he was conducting an interview with a very successful lady. I think he said it was Maria Shriver, something like that, from the Kennedy family, and he asks her, what's your definition of success? So he's expecting this big, long, complicated answer, and she gives him a very simple answer. She says, success is being a good daughter to my parents, a good mother to my children, a good wife to my husband. Simple, very basic things. So he sort of had an epiphany there, and he realized, I've been asking all of these people what their definition of success is, but I don't even know what my definition of success is. I don't even know how I define my own self. So how do you define yourself? If your sole purpose in this world is to be a father or a mother and nothing else, then what happens if a person loses their child and they're no longer a father or a mother? Or if their sole purpose is to be a worker, what happens when they don't have meaningful employment anymore? So we tend to define people, and we tend to define ourselves by the service that we give to society. Now this ties in with the whole idea of masculinity and femininity, and even when we talk about issues such as equal pay. And why are these even a reason in the first place? But this type of thinking is dangerous. I'll share a couple of examples with you. In 1911, there was a mechanical engineer by the name of Frederick Winslow Taylor. He wrote a book called The Principles of Scientific Management. And the whole idea of the Principles of Scientific Management was, how do we find a way to increase efficiency in the workplace? Because in America, the model of work was the agrarian model, and then it shifted to the industrial model. So before that time, before the Industrial Revolution, people, I mentioned the other day, the most common job for people, 4 out of 5 Americans were farmers. So to remove those farmers and then now put them into factories, especially during the days of World War I and World War II, where people needed to be in factories to produce, he wrote a book called The Principles of Scientific Management. The whole idea was, now you have these masses of people that you've gotten off the farms and you've put into the factory. Now what? How do you increase efficiency? So him naturally being a mechanical engineer, and if you've noticed, sometimes when you have a certain profession or you've learned something, you begin to see everything through that lens. So a mechanical engineer is going to look at everything in terms of efficiency, because as a mechanical engineer, you have to be very efficient in your process. If you're building something, it has to be extremely efficient. So you tend to see things based on your if you're a mathematician, what happens when you see numbers? Or if you're an English major, what happens if you see a word that is misspelled? If someone writes there instead of there or instead of there, what happens? You lose your mind. Why? Because that's the paradigm that you see everything. I had a relative one time who was building a home, and every time he would walk into somebody else's home, he would begin to measure things. How far is this corner from that corner? And, this platform from that platform. And this room, how big is it? Because it's something that he was involved in. So you begin to see from that point of view. So Frederick Winslow Taylor developed an entire philosophy which was referred to as Taylorism. Taylorism refers to the principles of scientific management. How do you increase efficiency in a workplace? So people were reduced in a factory, they were reduced to a commodity, to a pawn. Their value was based on how efficient they were. If a person is efficient, he stays, or she. If a person is not efficient, they go. Now, efficiency is important, but more important than efficiency is effectiveness. To be effective is different than being efficient. Efficient is doing things right. Effectiveness is doing the right things. So it's a little bit a notch above. Now, his intentions were very well. But because people were defined by how efficient they were used as pawns and commodity. It was a very good system in creating efficiency. But you know what the adverse effect was? Is that a few decades later, Nazi Germany began to use the same philosophy when they were building their state. If a person is not an efficient part of the state, he's done for. Another example I'll give you. When it comes to the idea of Marxism, socialism, communism, Robert Schuller writes in his book Self-Love, he talks about an example where in 1949, there was a girl who was 3 years old who in San Marino, California had fallen into a well. And as soon as she fell into that well, the city began to spend exorbitant amounts of money to try to pull her out. They spent a total of $250,000, and in the end, they could not save her life. So Robert Schuller talks about, he mentions a conversation between two American communists. So we still have communists. They still exist, by the way. They're still the American Communist Party. They're still around. So he talks about a conversation between them. He says that one of them said to the other that how ridiculous. Why would you spend $250,000 trying to save a life? Do you know what you can do with that money? You can build a hospital. And so what the author, what he was trying to say was that in reality, you can't really put a price on the life of a human being. So even though in terms of efficiency, you can think to yourself that $250,000 is not worth it, but in reality, $250,000 is not enough. It's not enough because the value of a life of a person is much more than that. So the conversation continues. I said, well, you can replace that child if you bring together two people and they create a child. 9 months later, that 3-year-old child can be replaced. That was the mentality. That's what happens when you reduce a person to a pawn, to a commodity. Their value is only based off of the value that they can provide in this world. Now, what is the Islamic viewpoint on this? We have a concept in Islam which has to do with diyat. What is a diya or diyat? Diya refers to a retaliatory compensation. So if you were to injure somebody on accident, a significant injury, you would have to pay that person retaliatory compensation. Some people, they call it blood money. So if you accidentally severed a person's finger or a person's hand, or if you, on accident, you took somebody's life, there is a diya. There is a retaliatory compensation that needs to be paid. Now, for a free male, what is the amount of the diya? If you accidentally take the life of a free male, it's 1,000 gold dinars, which in today's worth is about 4.25 kilograms of gold. I don't know how much that's worth in the market. Probably hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, what's the issue with that? Some people will say, okay, well, you're putting a price on the life of a human being. You're not putting a price on the life of the human being. And just to push the envelope a little bit further and maybe rattle your cage a little bit more. For a man, it's 1,000 dinars. For a woman, it's how much? It's 500. It's half the amount. Uh-oh. Some people become very upset at this. Number one, if the man, the head of the household, dies, that 1,000 dinar goes to whom? It doesn't go to him. It's not buried in his grave. It goes to his family. If a woman is killed, that 500 dinar goes to whom? It's not buried in her grave. It goes to her family. But then you're asking, okay, well, why? Why is there a difference between 1,000 and 500? The short answer is God said so. But there's a long answer to it as well. Because that doesn't satisfy, that doesn't satisfy the answer for everyone. The answer is that when you look at the diya, the retaliatory compensation, it's not effective, it's not reflective of what the person is worth, the life of the person. It has nothing to do with that. How do we know that? Because the Quran speaks about the value of a human life. من قتل نفسا بغير نفس أو فسادا في الأرض فكأنما قتل الناس جميعا ومن أحياها فكأنما أحيا الناس جميعا. That if you take a life, in reality it is as if you are taking the life of all of humanity. And if you give life, it is as if you are giving life to all of humanity. So in reality there's no real worth, there's no real value that you can place on the human being to say that, well, this person's life is worth 500, that person is worth 1,000, that person is worth 1,500. In light of the idea that during those days, the male, the head of the household, was seen as the main breadwinner. So if his life was taken, it's sort of like, if you think about today, the same philosophy of a life insurance policy. How long would it take for the family to recover, to financially get back on their feet, to financially recover from the loss that has happened from the loss of his life or the loss of her life? And our services that we provide to our family, they actually have value. There was a study that came out a number of years ago. It said that if you were to put value, if you were to put a price tag, if you were to provide a salary for the work that the average homemaker does, a woman who is taking care of her home, cooking, cleaning, staying up at night, making sure the kids are, being everything for the family. If you were to put a price tag on that and pay someone, now think about it, it's easy. If the mother and the father of the household were not to do any of those responsibilities and outsource it to someone else, you had a full-time person. I mean, the best that you can get today is a full-time nanny, but they're not going to wake up in the middle of the night and do the same thing that the mother does when the mother has to take care of the child at 3 a.m. But say that you had to put a price tag on that. How much do you think it was paid? It said more than $100,000. More than $100,000 for those services if you were to outsource them. But mothers do it for free, out of their care, out of their compassion, out of their love. So the work has a price tag. The nafs, the soul, does not have a price tag at all. What happens in what Robert Schuller was saying when it came to the idea of Marxism, communism, socialism, is that they put a price tag on the life of a human being, not just on the person's services. So this all goes back as to how do we define ourselves? And really the biggest issue here, why people tend to ask these questions in the first place, one reason is because we take God out of the equation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's why He says, لِلرِّجَالِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا اكْتَسَبُوا وَلِلنِّسَاءِ نَصِيبٌ مِّمَّا اكْتَسَبْنَ وَاسْأَلُوا اللَّهَ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. That each person shall receive what is due to them. Neither shall they be held more accountable to what God has burdened them with, nor shall their rights be taken away. So everything that God has put in your life, God has been very intentional with that and put it in your life for a reason. So when we talk about inequality, when we talk about the differences between masculinity and femininity and these roles, most of the time it's because we've taken God out of the equation. We don't see ourselves in our relationship to God. We see ourselves in our relationship to one another. And that's when comparison happens, not just between men and women, but between men and women as well. is because we don't realize the value of the life that God has given us. So we're constantly comparing ourselves to one another. And because we're constantly comparing ourselves to one another, we are constantly not happy with our life. So I want to share a couple of things with you. Number one is a youth psychologist that wrote the following about masculinity. He said, there are 4 areas when it comes to the idea of masculinity. There are 4 areas that men want to intrinsically succeed. These are the areas that men ask themselves, am I succeeding? Number 1 is as a son. All men look at themselves and think, am I acceptable to my father? Am I acceptable to my father figure? All men want to be good sons to their fathers and to their mothers. And that's why the Quran appeals to that very intrinsic nature. And it says, وَوَصَّيْنَا الْإِنسَانَ بِوَالِدَيْهِ إِحْسَانًا. That we commanded mankind, to be benevolent towards his parents, his and her parents. And of course, this verse specifically mentions the mother and the burden and the toil of the mother. حملته أمه كرها ووضعته كرها وحمله وفصاله 30 شهرا. So intrinsically, we want to be good sons to our fathers. This is one area that men want to succeed. Another is as a worker. So we ask ourselves the question that, am I competent enough to provide? This is a very intrinsic need that men have. Am I competent enough to provide? And in some economies, it's tougher than other economies. You know, when you study the roots and the causes of what was known as Al-Rabi' al-Arabi, the Arab Spring, which started around 2010, 2011, and there was a domino effect. And the first of the event was the gentleman who set himself on fire in Tunisia, if you remember that event. It was the first one. And the president of Tunisia left. He went to another country. Why did he set himself on fire? What was it that was burning inside of him that he had to set himself on fire? If you read his story, and he died a couple of days later from his injury, but it had to do with providing. The economy was so terrible that he could not provide properly. He could not get out of the bondage of debt. And in other countries, such as Egypt, such as Libya, such as Yemen, you see that the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues, was unemployment, the problem of unemployment. And what does that cause in the mind of man? That he is not competent enough to provide. And that's why you have young men who become confused in their identity whenever you have terrible economies, whenever people cannot get jobs. So one thing is the economy. So as a son, as a worker, as a husband, men have that question. As a husband, is he competent enough to take care of a wife, to take care of children, to raise a family? And number 4, as a warrior. What's a warrior? Warrior doesn't mean he puts on a shield and a sword and he goes out into the battlefield. Warrior means when you fight for a cause. When you fight for a cause. If you think about it, everybody becomes a warrior in something. Some people become a warrior and they become enthusiastic and they become fanatical when it comes to their sports teams and their dedication to their sports teams. And don't get me wrong, I'm a fan of sports myself, I watch. But that's not my cause and my fight and my battle cry. In fact, we were speaking with some of the shabab earlier today about different sporting events, and there's nothing wrong with that. But for some people, it's their battle cry. It's their cause that they live for. These are the type of people that they go to the sporting event and they paint their face and they paint their bellies and they stand in freezing cold weather. And when their team wins, they celebrate. And when their team loses, they're destroyed. They cry. I spoke to a gentleman one time, and he's a productive man, family man, but he said on Sunday mornings, nobody is allowed in my family to talk to me because he has to watch the Lions game every Sunday. He's originally from Dearborn, but he lives in Los Angeles. So it's 10 a.m. for him there, the game, not 1 p.m. He said during that time, nobody is allowed to talk to me at all. And he runs a business. He doesn't even take care of his business. 3 hours, I lay in bed and that's it. I only watch the Lions game, that's it. So that sometimes becomes a person's fight. It becomes a person's cause. You go to different arenas and you see an arena of 70,000 people, 80,000 people, 90,000 people. It becomes a person's battle cry. Because intrinsically, we want to be warriors. Intrinsically, we want to fight for something. We want to stand up for something. The problem is that most of us, we're standing up for the right thing, the wrong thing. We're fighting for the wrong cause. Imam Hussein alayhi salam taught us that when it comes to confrontation, when it comes to standing up and fighting, you do so based on the correct principles, on the right principles. He taught us what it meant to truly be a warrior and go out into the battlefield. It's not just about the battlefield. The battle is within sometimes. But people are confused. So when you look at the warrior on TV, for instance, if you watch Hollywood, they idolize personalities such as James Bond. James Bond's the guy that has it all. He drives an Aston Martin. He wears not a Rolex, he wears an Omega because, Rolex is not cool enough. He wears the best suits. His relationship status, everything is no strings attached. And he always wins at the end. He always beats the bad guy. Another model for masculinity and manliness, John Wayne, the gunslinger, lone gunslinger. I can do it all by myself. And the reality is nobody can do anything by themselves. Nobody can achieve any victory by themselves. That's why you look at this massive wave when it comes to self-help. And there's nothing wrong with reading books on personal development. I actually encourage that all the time. But the idea of self-help, that in order to become successful, I don't need anyone. Or that someone is self-made. You see on Instagram, people all the time, and on social media, people that are self-made. Nobody is self-made. This is an idea called Luciferianism. Lucifer is the English word for Iblis. Iblis saw himself, was the first person to see himself as independent. That I don't need anyone. خَلَقْتَنِي مِن نَارٍ وَخَلَقْتَهُ مِن طِينٍ. You created me of fire. I made of fire. I don't need anyone. I don't need to prostrate to someone made of clay. The reality is we all need someone, and that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ya ayyuhan nasu antumul fuqara'u ila Allah wallahu huwal ghaniyul hamid. So when it comes to our fight, what are we fighting for? Most people, they're fighting for the wrong thing. There's this term that they spread around called the manconomy, if you've heard. So the manconomy it's a type of economy that exploits the desire of men to be better. And recently this year they had the controversy with the Gillette commercial, if you remember. Gillette, the company that makes the razor blades for men. And their slogan 30 years ago in 1989 during the Super Bowl was, do you remember the commercial? What's their slogan? The best a man can get. So 30 years later, they decided we're going to do the best a man can be. So it's not about getting out of the world, it's about being. And it caused a lot of controversy. So it caused in the minds of men everywhere that they want to be better. So the manconomy is a term it's assigned to the economy that is dedicated to making men feel better about themselves, making men more masculine. Why? Because we've strayed so far away from principles, we have no idea what it means to be masculine anymore. And we have no idea what it means to be feminine. And then on the other side, it's confused women. So women have also adopted, not all women, but some women have adopted one-upsmanship, that we don't need men anymore, and men say, well, we don't need women anymore, and this is what happens eventually when we take God out of the equation, when we remove Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of the equation, is one-upsmanship. We begin to compare one another to ourselves. Allah says, وَاسْأَلُوا اللَّهَ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. Stop looking at everybody else. Stop wondering, this person has it better, that person has it better. If I was only a man, if I was only a woman, if I was only on the moon, I would do better. وَاسْأَلُوا اللَّهَ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. Turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So let's place God back in the equation, and I'll end with this when we talk about masculinity. You know, when you think about Imam Hussein alayhi salam, you think of a man who was chivalrous. You think of a man who was brave, a man who was courageous. And when you talk about those characteristics, you know this how the saying goes, boys don't cry. That you're not supposed to cry, that you're supposed to be courageous. Imam Hussein alayhi salam, while all of those attributes were true, narrations say that when he would speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his eyes would draw tears from his eyes as if it was a waterfall. That his beard would be drenched in his tears. I'll give you an example, just a small excerpt from Dua Arafah, narrated by Bishr wa Bashir ibn Ghalib. These were two of the companions of the Imam that accompanied him on the day of Arafat. And they narrated this dua. Imam Hussein alayhi salam says, and notice the words of tenderness, of love, of compassion. وحفظتني في المهد طفلا صبيا ورزقتني من الغذاء لبنا مريا وعطفت علي قلوب الحواضن وكفلتني الأمهات الرواحم وكلأتني من طوارق الجان وسلمتني من الزيادة والنقصان فتعاليت يا رحيم يا رحمن. Such beautiful words. You watched over me in the cradle. Imam Hussein alayhi salam is speaking to God. You watched over me in the cradle as an infant boy, provided me with food, wholesome milk. You turned the hearts of the nursemaids towards me. You entrusted my upbringing to compassionate mothers. You guarded me from the calamities brought by the jinn, and you kept me secure from excess and lack, O merciful, O compassionate. Such a tender conversation that he has with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So sometimes the more we grow in our masculinity and our courage, the more we need to increase in our tenderness. The more we need to increase in our compassion and our love and our mercy towards people. Now I want to end by turning your hearts to Karbala, and this is the night that we remember the sacrifice of Al-Qasim, the young man, the son of Al-Imam Al-Hasan Al-Mushtaba salawatullah wa salamu alayh. And to make a long story short, on that day, the day of Ashura, Al-Qasim came to his uncle, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, seeking permission. And narrations say that there was a letter that was written. This letter was written many years before by his father. It was directed to him. And when he opened up the letter and read it, it said, بُنَيَّ قَاسِمْ إِذَا اشْتَدَّتْ عَلَيْكَ الْأُمُورِ فَعَلَيْكَ بِنُصْرَةِ عَمِّكَ الْحُسَيْنِ. O Qasim, if you find yourself in a time of tragedy and calamity, come to the aid of your uncle Hussein. So with that, he came to his uncle, seeking permission to go out and fight into the battlefield. But Imam Hussein could not give permission to his nephew. His nephew was a remnant of his brother Al-Hasan. He said to him, my dear Qasim, Bunayya Qasim, Anta wadi'atu akhi Al-Hasan. You are the remnant of my brother Al-Hasan. You were with us. You remind us of my brother Al-Hasan. How could I let you go out into the battlefield? But he was insistent on going out into the battlefield. When Imam Hussein saw that he was insistent, he asked him a question. He says, كَيْفَ تَجِدُ الْمَوْتِ? How do you see death? A young man, I want to know your perspective on death now that you are going out into the battlefield. He answers to him, he says, يَا عَمْ فِي نُصْرَتِكُمْ أَحْلَى مِنَ الْعَسَلِ. If it is in your victory, if it is in your aid, then it is sweeter than honey. So Imam Hussein alayhi salam turns to his sister Zainab, Ukhayya Zainab, Itini bi'imamati akhi al-Hasan, bring for me the turban of my brother al-Hasan. Imam Hussein alayhi salam places the turban on the young man. He places his armor on him. He gives him his weapon and he sends him out into the battlefield. Al-Qasim alayhi salam went out into the battlefield and he introduced himself to the people, for those that did not know him. In tunkiruni fa ana najru al-Hasan, sibtu al-Nabi al-Mustafa wal-Mu'taman. If you do not know me, then I am the son of Al-Hasan. I am the grandson of Rasulullah al-Mu'taman, the trusted one. And he went out into the battlefield fighting like a valiant warrior, like a brave warrior, a man who was very young in age, but fought with the valiance of his grandfather Amir al-Mu'mineen, of his uncle Al-Hussein alayhi salam, of his uncle Al-Abbas. This was a young man of Banu Hashim, no ordinary young man. He went out into the battlefield fighting until finally, narration says that he became distracted because the strap on his sandal snapped, it ripped. So as he kneeled down and as he bent down to take care of it, one of the enemy soldiers came up to him and he struck him on his head. He dealt him a blow to his head. Al-Qasim fell on the floor, blood gushing everywhere. Imam Hussein alayhi salam ran out to him. Al-Qasim called out to his uncle. Imam Hussein ran out to him. The narration says that there was an enemy standing there. Imam Hussein unsheathed his sword and he fought off that enemy. And he began to say to his son Al-Qasim, he said to him, يَعُزُّ اللَّهُ عَلَىٰ عَمِّكَ أَن تَدْعُوهُ فَلَا يُجِيبُكَ. It is so hard for me, O Qasim, that you call upon me, but I cannot respond. And if I respond, I cannot come to your aid. بُعْدًا وَاللَّهِ لِقَوْمٍ قَتَلُوكَ وَخَصْمُهُمْ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ جَدُّكَ وَأَبُوكَ. He says, do not worry, O Qasim, for these people that fought against you, their enemy on the day of judgment, their adversary shall be your grandfather. Inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات